On Christmas night, 1776, 2,400 men stood on the bank of a frozen river, waiting to cross into a storm. Great slabs of ice ground against the boats. Snow turned to sleet, and sleet to freezing rain. The password that night was not chosen for ceremony. It was victory or death. Because the man leading them knew exactly what this was, the last throw of the dice. If the crossing failed, his army would not survive the winter, and the American Revolution would die with it. His name was George Washington, and 6 months earlier, he had been celebrating the greatest triumph of his life. That triumph was Boston, where Washington had driven out the British without a major battle. But Britain's answer was the largest invasion force it had ever sent across an ocean. In the summer of 1776, more than 400 ships appeared off New York, carrying over 30,000 professional soldiers. What followed was a catastrophe. Washington's army was outflanked and shattered on Long Island, chased across Manhattan, and driven from one position after another. At Fort Washington, nearly 3,000 Americans were captured in a single day. The general who had humiliated Britain at Boston now watched his own army fall apart. Through November and December, Washington retreated across New Jersey, with the British hunting close behind. Every week, his army grew smaller. Men deserted by the hundreds. Others simply went home when their enlistments ran out. The force that had numbered 19,000 around New York was down to barely 3,000 ragged, freezing men. Congress abandoned Philadelphia, expecting it to fall. British commanders wrote home that the war was effectively over. One more season, and the rebellion would collapse on its own. Even Washington confessed in a letter to his brother, "I think the game is pretty near up." And then there was the calendar. On December 31st, the enlistments of almost the entire Continental Army would expire, and the men would be legally free to walk away. Washington was not facing defeat in battle. He was facing something worse, an army that would simply cease to exist in 6 days without the British firing a shot. That week, Thomas Paine published words that spread through the camps like fire. "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington understood what the moment demanded. He could not wait out the winter. He needed a victory now, or there would be no army left to win one. Across the Delaware River, in the town of Trenton, sat a garrison of 1,500 Hessians, German professional soldiers hired by the British Crown, and among the most feared troops in the world. Washington's plan was as desperate as it was daring. Cross the ice-choked river on Christmas night, march 9 miles through a storm in darkness, and fall on Trenton at dawn before the garrison could wake. 3 separate columns would cross at 3 different points and close on the town like a fist. Every officer who heard the plan understood the same thing. In this weather, against these troops, there would be no second chance.
Enjoying the show? Then do your duty, soldier. Fire a volley at that like button and subscribe to Steel and Stripes.
In Trenton, Colonel Johann Rall had been warned. Loyalist informers reported that the Americans were planning something. A British officer even predicted an attack the moment the river froze. Rall waved it all away. He built no fortifications, dug no trenches. "Let them come," he scoffed. "We will go at them with the bayonet." His blue-coated German veterans were exhausted from constant militia raids and endless false alarms, and their commander had stopped taking any of it seriously. Meanwhile, American eyes watched Trenton constantly, mapping the guard posts, the roads, the routines. One army was watching, the other was playing cards. On Christmas Eve, Washington gathered his officers in a farmhouse and locked the plan in place. A young doctor named Benjamin Rush was visiting headquarters that night, and he later remembered watching the generals scribbling on small scraps of paper as they spoke. One scrap slipped to the floor. Rush picked it up and read 3 words: victory or death. It was the password for the operation, and it was not a slogan. It was arithmetic. If the attack failed, the army would be trapped against a frozen river, and the revolution would be over by New Year's Day. Washington had stopped planning how to survive. He was planning how to win. At McConkey's Ferry, as darkness fell on Christmas Day, the army began to move. They crossed in Durham boats, long, black, flat-bottomed cargo craft, manned by Massachusetts fishermen who read the murderous river like an open book. Chunks of ice slammed the hulls out of the dark. The storm rose into a howling northeaster, and still they crossed, hour after hour. Men, then horses, then, heaviest of all, Henry Knox's 18 cannon, the same guns and muscle work that had won Boston. It took until 3 in the morning. The army was across. It was also hours behind schedule. The plan had called for 3 crossings, 3 columns converging on Trenton from different directions. In the storm and the ice, the other 2 failed completely. Not a man of them reached the far bank. Washington's column was alone now, 2,400 men against a garrison of professionals with the timetable wrecked and dawn approaching. Any reasonable commander would have turned back. Washington made his decision on the riverbank, and it was the same decision he always made when the cause hung by a thread. They would march. Whatever waited at Trenton, they would meet it. The 9 miles to Trenton were a frozen nightmare. Sleet drove sideways into the men's faces. Hundreds had no boots, their feet wrapped in rags. And officers later swore they followed the route by the bloody footprints in the snow. 2 men sat down to rest and froze to death where they sat. When an officer reported that the storm had soaked the muskets and half the powder was useless, Washington's answer passed down the column like a blade. Then use the bayonet. The town was close now. Incredibly, the Hessian patrols had been pulled in because of the weather. No one saw them coming. At 8 in the morning, the storm at their backs, the Americans burst out of the tree line in 2 columns. Knox's cannon wheeled into position at the heads of the 2 main streets and swept them clean. Hessians spilled from their barracks into the sleet, trying to form ranks, and were shattered before they could. Colonel Rawl was shot from his horse, mortally wounded. In 45 minutes, it was over. Nearly 900 Hessians were captured, along with cannon, muskets, and desperately needed supplies. And in the fighting itself, the Americans had not lost a single man killed. The quietest victory came days later on New Year's Eve, with the enlistments expiring at midnight. Washington rode out in front of the ranks and asked his soldiers, frostbitten, exhausted, owed months of back pay, to stay just 6 weeks more. The drums rolled. At first, not one man stepped forward. So Washington wheeled his horse and spoke to them again, not as a general, but plainly, as one man to others. Your country is at stake, and you have done more than could ever be asked, and you are the only force that can finish it. One by one, the veterans stepped out of line. The army lived. The victory brought the empire down on him. Lord Cornwallis force-marched 8,000 men to Trenton and found the Americans dug in behind a creek called the Assunpink. 3 times the British rushed the narrow stone bridge. 3 times American cannon and musketry blasted them back into the dusk. Satisfied, Cornwallis made camp. "We've got the old fox safe now," he reportedly said. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." That night, Washington left his campfires burning, wrapped his cannon wheels in rags, and slipped his entire army away in the dark, not in retreat. He was marching on the British rear. At dawn, Washington's tired column collided with 2 British regiments outside Princeton. The American vanguard buckled under the first volleys and began to break. And then Washington himself galloped into the gap, reining his horse between the two armies, barely 30 paces from the British line. "Parade with us, my brave fellows," he shouted. Both sides fired. When the smoke cleared, the general sat untouched in the saddle. The line rallied and swept forward, and the British broke, some fleeing up the road, the rest surrendering inside the college itself. In 10 days, Washington had beaten the finest army on earth 3 times. The British, stunned, pulled back and abandoned almost all of New Jersey. Captured Hessians were marched through the streets of Philadelphia, past crowds who had expected to see British troops enter as conquerors. The news ran through the colonies and across the Atlantic like a thunderclap. Recruits began arriving at camps that had been empty 2 weeks before. In Paris, ministers who had dismissed the rebellion took a second look. 10 days earlier, the American Revolution had been dying quietly in the winter mud. Now the world knew it was alive, and that its general was dangerous. Frederick the Great of Prussia, perhaps the most celebrated soldier of the age, is said to have called this campaign one of the most brilliant in the history of war, not because of its size, but because of when it came. Washington attacked at the exact moment when attacking seemed insane, when his army was dying, his cause was collapsing, and every rational voice said, "Retreat." That was the calculation Britain never understood. At Boston, he had won with patience. At Trenton, he won with pure nerve. A revolution does not survive on strength. It survives on the refusal to die.